I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who stayed quiet while her life slowly unraveled, but somewhere between the third year of our marriage and the morning I found myself standing in our kitchen at 5:30 a.m. making breakfast for a man who hadn't looked me in the eye in weeks, I realized I had become exactly that. My name is Sarah. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Millbrook, a town in upstate New York where everyone knows your business before you do, where the same families have owned the same houses for generations, and where leaving a marriage isn't just a personal decision, but a public spectacle. My husband David and I moved here 6 years ago when he got a job at the regional bank, one of those solid, respectable positions that made the older folks nod approvingly when we introduced ourselves at the Methodist Church potluck. I had been working as a graphic designer remotely, which gave me flexibility but also made me somehow less visible in a town that measured worth by how often you showed up to things. David fit in immediately. He had that easy charm, the kind that made him remember everyone's names and ask about their kids and their hunting trips, the kind that got him invited to poker nights and asked to help coach Little League even though we didn't have children. I was proud of him at first, the way he could walk into the hardware store and come out 20 minutes later having solved someone's plumbing problem and been invited to a barbecue. But slowly, so slowly I didn't notice it happening, his life expanded while mine contracted. It started with small things. He'd come home later and later, always with a reasonable explanation: drinks with clients, helping Tom fix his truck, a last-minute meeting that ran long. I'd have dinner waiting, and he'd eat it while scrolling through his phone, offering distracted murmurs when I'd tried to talk about my day. When I suggested we needed to spend more time together, he'd sigh like I was being needy, like I didn't understand the pressure he was under. The house we rented was a small two-bedroom colonial on Maple Street, white with black shutters, a front porch that needed repainting, and a backyard that backed up to the Hendersons' property. Mrs. Henderson was 73 and watched everything from her kitchen window, which meant our marriage was under constant surveillance, though she was kind enough to pretend she didn't notice when David's car didn't come home until after midnight, or when I sat on the porch steps in my bathrobe at dawn, drinking coffee and staring at nothing. The problems got worse after David's promotion in September. He became assistant branch manager, which came with a small raise and a significant increase in his sense of self-importance. Suddenly, he was going to regional conferences, networking events, Chamber of Commerce dinners. He bought new suits, started going to the gym at 5 a.m., got a haircut every 2 weeks instead of every month. I watched him transform into a shinier version of himself while I stayed exactly the same, working from our spare bedroom that doubled as my office, wearing the same jeans and sweaters, eating lunch alone at the kitchen table. By December, I felt like a ghost in my own life. David was consumed with year-end reports and holiday parties, and I was left to decorate our house alone, stringing lights along the porch railing while neighbors walked by and waved, probably wondering why my husband wasn't out there helping me. I went to the Christmas Eve service by myself because David had a last-minute thing at work, sat in our usual pew alone while couples and families filled in around me, and when Pastor Mike asked everyone to greet their neighbors, I shook hands with strangers and felt the weight of their pity. Millbrook was the kind of place where a woman alone at church on Christmas Eve was noticed, remarked upon, worried over in the way small towns do, with a mixture of genuine concern and thinly veiled judgment. The week between Christmas and New Year's Eve was always strange in Millbrook, a kind of suspended time when the town felt emptier, quieter, like everyone was holding their breath before the next thing. The hardware store closed early, the diner had shorter hours, and the streets were slushy with half-melted snow that refroze every night into treacherous patches of ice. I spent most of that week working on a logo redesign for a client in Boston, grateful for the distraction, while David was in and out, busy with inventory audits and planning meetings. We barely spoke. On the 28th, I asked him what he wanted to do for New Year's Eve, and he said we were going to a party at the Richardsons. I didn't know the Richardsons well. Mark Richardson was David's boss, the branch manager, a man in his early 50s with silver hair and a loud laugh, married to a woman named Diane who wore a lot of turquoise jewelry and hosted book club. I'd met them twice, both times briefly, and had not been invited to the book club, despite Diane saying she'd love to have me, which was small town code for she wouldn't. "I didn't know we were invited," I said, and David shrugged. "Mark invited me weeks ago. I thought I told you." He hadn't, but I didn't argue. I asked what I should wear, and he glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between indifference and irritation. "I don't know, Sarah, just wear something nice. It's not a big deal." But it felt like a big deal to me because I hadn't been out with David in months, hadn't been to a party or a dinner or anything that required me to be more than the woman who kept the house running and stayed out of the way. I went through my closet that night, pulling out dresses I hadn't worn in years, holding them up to the mirror and feeling a creeping sense of inadequacy. I settled on a dark green dress, simple and flattering, with long sleeves and a hemline that hit just above the knee. On the morning of New Year's Eve, I woke up to find David already gone. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter saying he had to go into the office for a few hours, that he'd be back by early afternoon, that I should be ready to leave by 7. The house was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into old houses in upstate New York in the dead of winter, and I turned up the thermostat and made coffee, standing by the window and watching the gray light spread over the snow-covered yard. I spent the day cleaning the house, even though no one was coming over, keeping my hands busy so my mind wouldn't spiral. David came home around 3, went straight upstairs to shower, and when he came back down, he was wearing one of his new suits, charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt, and he looked good, better than he'd looked in a long time, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe? Or loss? Or the memory of when I used to be the reason he dressed up. I went upstairs to get ready, took my time with my hair and makeup, trying to feel like a person someone might want to be seen with. When I came downstairs, David was on his phone, texting someone, and he barely looked up. "You ready?" he asked, and I said yes, and he said, "Let's go then," and we walked out into the cold evening without him saying I looked nice or even really looking at me at all. The drive to the Richardsons took 15 minutes, winding through the quiet streets of Millbrook, past the town square with its gazebo strung with white lights, past the elementary school and the fire station. David drove in silence, his jaw tight, and I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but I'd learned that asking what was wrong usually made things worse, so I stayed quiet and watched the dark trees slide past the window. The Richardsons lived on the edge of town in a large colonial that sat on 2 acres, the kind of house that announced success without being ostentatious, with a circular driveway and tasteful landscaping and a front door painted glossy black. There were already several cars parked outside when we arrived, and I could see warm light glowing from the windows, hear the faint sound of music and laughter. David parked and got out without waiting for me, and I followed him up the walkway, my heels clicking on the salted pavement, my breath fogging in the frigid air. Diane answered the door almost immediately, her face flushed and cheerful, wearing a silver sequined top and black pants, a glass of wine already in her hand. "David, Sarah, come in, it's freezing out there." She ushered us inside, and the house smelled like cinnamon and wine and expensive candles. David moved ahead of me, greeting Mark Richardson with a firm handshake, slipping easily into the role of the confident young professional. And I stood there holding my purse, feeling like an accessory he'd forgotten to leave in the car. Diane led me toward the kitchen, chattering about how glad she was we could make it, handed me a glass of red wine, and I took a sip and felt the warmth spread through my chest. The kitchen opened into a large living area where about 20 people were mingling, some I recognized from church or the grocery store, others I'd never seen before. I spotted David across the room, already deep in conversation with a group of men, laughing at something someone said, and I felt that familiar ache of being on the outside of his life. I drifted toward a group of women standing near the fireplace, introduced myself, and they smiled politely and made space for me in their circle. They were talking about their kids, and I had nothing to contribute, so I just listened and sipped my wine and tried to look engaged. The evening wore on, and I moved through the party like a shadow, refilling my wine glass, making small talk, and watching David from across the room. He was in his element, charming and confident, and I realized with a sinking feeling that he was happier here, with these people, than he ever was at home with me.
Around 11, people started gathering in the living room for the midnight countdown, the energy shifting, becoming more festive. I took a glass of champagne and stood near the back of the room, watching as couples paired off, as David stood with Mark and a few other men near the fireplace. I didn't want to be here, didn't want to pretend everything was fine, so I stayed and waited for midnight to come and take this terrible year away.
The living room had filled up considerably by 11:15. Bodies pressed closer together, voices louder, the air thick with perfume and cologne, and the sharp fizz of champagne being poured into too many glasses. Someone had turned up the music, something upbeat and forgettable, and a few people were swaying near the dining room, not quite dancing, but moving enough to show they were having a good time. I stayed where I was, back against the wall, near the bookshelf, holding my champagne and watching the room like I was observing a play I hadn't auditioned for. Diane was flitting around, making sure everyone had drinks, her sequined top catching the light every time she moved, and Mark was holding court near the fireplace, telling some story that had the men around him laughing, David included. My husband's face was flushed. Whether from alcohol or excitement, I couldn't tell, but he looked relaxed in a way he never looked at home, his shoulders loose, his smile easy. I took a sip of champagne and felt the bubbles prick the back of my throat. Across the room, a woman I didn't know was watching me with curious eyes, the kind of look that said she was trying to figure out who I was and why I was standing alone. I gave her a polite smile and looked away, focusing instead on the Christmas tree in the corner, a massive Douglas fir decorated with white lights and silver ornaments, tasteful and expensive like everything else in this house. Through the window behind it, I could see snow starting to fall again, light flakes drifting down through the glow of the porch lights, and I thought about how beautiful it would be to be outside right now, away from all these people, walking through the quiet streets with the snow muffling every sound. But I was here, trapped in this performance of normalcy, waiting for midnight like it might somehow fix things. A woman approached me then, someone I vaguely recognized from the grocery store, maybe mid-40s with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. "You're Sarah, right? David's wife?" I nodded and she smiled warmly. "I'm Jennifer. My husband works with Mark at the regional office. I don't think we've officially met." We shook hands and she asked how long David and I had been in Millbrook, and I told her 6 years, and she said they'd been here for 12, that her kids were in high school now, that time just flew. She was kind, easy to talk to, and I felt myself relax slightly as we chatted about the town, about the winter, about nothing important. She asked what I did for work and seemed genuinely interested when I told her about graphic design, said she'd always thought that sounded creative and fulfilling, and I appreciated that she didn't follow it up with questions about why I didn't have kids or when David and I were planning to start a family. We talked for maybe 10 minutes before her husband came over, a tall man with glasses who introduced himself as Phil, and the three of us stood there making pleasant conversation while the party swirled around us. At one point, Jennifer asked if David and I had plans for the new year, any trips or projects, and I opened my mouth to answer, but realized I had no idea what David's plans were, that we hadn't talked about the future in months, that I couldn't remember the last time we'd planned anything together. "Nothing concrete yet," I said, and Jennifer nodded and said, "Well, the year is young." And I smiled and thought about how the year hadn't even started and I was already exhausted by it. Around 11:30, Diane clinked a fork against her glass and announced they'd be starting the countdown soon, that everyone should make sure they had champagne, that there were party hats and noisemakers on the table if anyone wanted them. A few people grabbed the hats, silly, glittery things that said Happy New Year in curling script, and put them on with exaggerated enthusiasm. I stayed where I was, watching as couples started gravitating toward each other, as the single people clustered in groups, as the room reorganized itself around the ritual of midnight. I looked for David and found him still near the fireplace, but he'd moved slightly, was now standing next to a woman I hadn't noticed before.
She was younger than me, maybe late 20s, with long blonde hair and a red dress that fit her perfectly, and she was laughing at something David was saying, her hand touching his arm in that casual way that could mean nothing or could mean everything. I felt something cold settle in my chest, not quite jealousy, but something adjacent to it, a recognition of how easily he connected with other people, how effortlessly he could make someone laugh, how he saved all that charm for everyone except me. I watched them for a moment longer, watched the way he leaned in slightly when he talked to her, the way she tilted her head and smiled, and then I looked away because it hurt too much to keep watching. Diane had moved off to find her husband, and I was alone again, holding my champagne and feeling the weight of the evening pressing down on me. The snow was falling harder now, visible through the windows, and I thought about how beautiful it would be to be outside right now, away from all these people, walking through the quiet streets with the snow muffling every sound. But I was here, trapped in this performance of normalcy, waiting for midnight like it might somehow fix things. Around 11:50, the energy in the room shifted again, became more focused, more electric. People were checking their phones, comparing the time on the television to their watches, making sure they wouldn't miss the moment. Someone passed around the noisemakers, cheap plastic horns that would be obnoxious in about 10 minutes, and a few people were already blowing them experimentally, filling the room with sharp, discordant sounds. I looked around for David again and saw him laughing with Mark, saw the easy camaraderie between them, and I felt a surge of something I couldn't quite name. Resentment maybe, or grief for what we'd lost, or anger at myself for letting it get this bad. I watched them for a moment longer, watched the way he leaned in slightly when he talked to her, the way she tilted her head and smiled, and then I looked away because it hurt too much to keep watching. Diane had moved off to find her husband, and I was alone again, holding my champagne and feeling the weight of the evening pressing down on me. The snow was falling harder now, visible through the windows, and I thought about how beautiful it would be to be outside right now, away from all these people, walking through the quiet streets with the snow muffling every sound. But I was here, trapped in this performance of normalcy, waiting for midnight like it might somehow fix things.
At 11:40, someone turned on the television, tuning it to the New Year's Eve broadcast from Times Square, and the room's attention shifted toward the screen where thousands of people were packed together in the cold, waiting for the ball to drop. The volume was loud, the announcers' voices cutting through the party chatter, and people started gathering closer to watch. I stayed on the periphery, not quite part of the group, but not entirely separate either, and I could feel the anticipation building, that strange collective energy that comes with marking time, with believing that midnight somehow matters, that the flip of a calendar can change anything. David had moved away from the woman in the red dress and was now standing with Mark and a few other men, and I wondered if I should go stand next to him, if that's what a good wife would do, but I couldn't make myself move. Diane appeared beside me with a bottle of champagne, topping off my glass even though I hadn't asked. "You doing okay, honey?" she asked, and I said yes, I was fine, and she patted my arm and said, "David's such a wonderful guy. Mark just raves about him. You must be so proud." I nodded and said I was, and she smiled and moved on to refill someone else's glass, and I stood there holding my champagne and feeling like a liar. The truth was, I didn't know if I was proud of David anymore. I was proud of who he'd been, maybe, or who I thought he was, but the man he'd become, distant, dismissive, more interested in impressing strangers than in being kind to his wife, I didn't know how to feel about him at all. At 11:50, the energy in the room shifted again, became more focused, more electric. People were checking their phones, comparing the time on the television to their watches, making sure they wouldn't miss the moment. Someone passed around the noisemakers, cheap plastic horns that would be obnoxious in about 10 minutes, and a few people were already blowing them experimentally, filling the room with sharp, discordant sounds. I looked around for David again and saw him laughing with Mark, saw the easy camaraderie between them, and I felt a surge of something I couldn't quite name. Resentment, maybe, or grief for what we'd lost, or anger at myself for letting it get this bad.
I thought about walking over to him, about standing next to him for the countdown, like we were a united front, but something stopped me. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness, or the simple fact that I was tired of always being the one to reach out, to try, to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. At 11:55, Diane turned up the volume on the television, and everyone's attention locked onto the screen. The crowd in Times Square was roaring, a sea of faces and lights and confetti cannons ready to explode, and the announcers were doing that breathless commentary they do every year, talking about new beginnings and fresh starts, and all the hopeful nonsense people tell themselves when one arbitrary day ends and another begins. I finished my champagne and set the empty glass on the bookshelf behind me, and I realized my hands were shaking slightly, though I wasn't sure if it was from the cold, or the alcohol, or the anxiety that had been building in my chest all night. The countdown was about to start, and I had no idea where I was supposed to be or who I was supposed to be standing next to, and the absurdity of that, of being married and feeling completely alone, hit me so hard I almost laughed. At 11:58, people started pairing off more deliberately, couples finding each other, friends grouping together, everyone positioning themselves for the midnight kiss or hug or whatever ritual they'd chosen. I saw Jennifer and Phil standing together near the window, his arm around her waist, and I felt a pang of envy so sharp it took my breath away. I looked for David one more time and saw him still with Mark, but now he was looking around the room, his eyes scanning the crowd, and for a moment I thought he was looking for me, that he'd realized we should be together for this, but then his gaze passed right over me like I wasn't there, like I was invisible, and I felt something inside me crack just a little bit more. The television announcer's voice rose in pitch, signaling that the countdown was about to begin, and the room started to quiet. Everyone's attention focusing on the screen, on the glowing ball suspended above Times Square, on the numbers that would tick down from 60 to 0 and supposedly change everything. I stood there against the wall, alone, holding nothing, and I thought about all the New Year's Eves David and I had spent together, the early years when we'd stayed home and cooked dinner and kissed at midnight like it meant something, and I wondered when exactly we'd stopped being those people, when we'd become strangers who shared a house and a last name and nothing else that mattered. The countdown began, 60, 59, 58, and the room started chanting along, voices rising in unison, and I felt the weight of the year that was ending, all the small disappointments and quiet heartbreaks, all the ways I'd made myself smaller to accommodate David's growing ego, all the nights I'd gone to bed alone, even though he was right there next to me. At 30 seconds, David finally looked at me. Our eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something there, recognition maybe, or regret, but then his expression hardened into something I couldn't read, something that looked almost like contempt, and he turned away. The countdown continued, 20, 19, 18, and I realized with absolute clarity that he wasn't going to come over to me, that we weren't going to stand together at midnight, that whatever fragile thread had been holding our marriage together had finally snapped. The room was loud now, everyone shouting the numbers, the energy building toward that arbitrary moment of transition, and I stood there frozen, watching my husband's back. Watching him laugh with his boss, watching him exist in a world where I didn't matter, and I felt something inside me shift into something cold and final and strangely liberating. 10, 9, 8. The room was roaring now, people raising their glasses, noisemakers at the ready. 7, 6, 5. I could see Diane grabbing Mark's hand, see couples leaning towards each other. 4, 3, 2. And then David turned around one more time, looked directly at me across the crowded room, and said something I couldn't hear over the noise, but could read perfectly on his lips, and my blood turned to ice. 1. The room exploded into noise, cheers, horns, music, the television blaring, but all I could hear was the ringing silence in my own head as I stared at David across the room, trying to process what I'd just seen. His lips had formed the words clearly, deliberately, and even though the countdown chaos had swallowed the sound, I knew exactly what he'd said. You ruined my year. 4 words, Simple, devastating, meant for me to see, to understand, to carry into this new year like a stone in my chest. Around us, people were hugging and kissing, throwing confetti that Diane must have handed out when I wasn't paying attention, and the television showed the ball drop in Times Square, thousands of people celebrating while I stood frozen against the wall, my husband's words echoing in my mind. David turned away immediately after saying it, like he'd delivered a verdict and didn't need to wait for my reaction, and Mark clapped him on the shoulder, pulling him into one of those brief, masculine hugs, and then Diane was there kissing Mark, and the woman in the red dress was hugging someone, and the whole room was a blur of motion and joy and new beginnings, while I stood perfectly still, trying to remember how to breathe. Jennifer appeared in front of me, smiling, wishing me a happy new year, and I heard myself say it back, heard my voice sound almost normal, and she hugged me briefly before moving on to someone else, and I was grateful she didn't seem to notice that I was falling apart. I needed to get out of this room. I needed air, space, somewhere I could think without all these people pressing in on me. I pushed off from the wall and made my way toward the hallway, moving through the crowd with my head down, avoiding eye contact, and I found the bathroom and locked myself inside. It was a large guest bathroom, all cream tiles and brass fixtures, and a candle burning on the counter that smelled like vanilla. I gripped the edge of the sink and stared at myself in the mirror, at my carefully applied makeup and my grandmother's pearl earrings and my dark green dress, and I looked like someone who had her life together, someone who belonged at a party like this. And the disconnect between how I looked and how I felt was so vast I almost laughed. You ruined my year. I played the words over and over, trying to understand what he meant, what I'd done that was so terrible it had ruined an entire year of his life. I'd made him breakfast every morning. I'd kept our house clean. I'd asked about his day, listened to his complaints about work, supported his promotion, stayed out of his way when he needed space. I'd been quiet when he came home late, patient when he ignored me, understanding when he said he was too tired or too stressed or too busy. I'd made myself smaller and smaller, trying to be the wife he seemed to want, and apparently even that wasn't enough. Apparently, my mere existence was a burden, a problem, something that had ruined him. I felt tears prick my eyes, and I blinked them back hard, refusing to cry, refusing to give him that. I turned on the cold water and wet my hands, pressed them against my cheeks, trying to calm the heat I felt rising there. Someone knocked on the door, and I called out that I'd be just a minute, and I heard footsteps retreat down the hallway. I couldn't stay in here forever. I had to go back out there, had to face the party and face David and figure out what came next. I dried my hands, checked my reflection one more time, and unlocked the door. The hallway was empty, and I could hear the party continuing in the living room, slightly quieter now, the initial frenzy of midnight having passed. I walked slowly back toward the noise, and when I entered the living room, I saw that people had spread out again, some sitting on the couches, others standing in small groups, everyone holding fresh drinks and settling into the second phase of the evening. I looked for David and found him near the dining room table, talking to Mark and another man I didn't recognize, and he didn't look my way. I needed another drink. I went to the kitchen where Diane had set up a bar area, and I poured myself a generous glass of white wine, something cold and crisp that might cut through the fog in my head. A man I vaguely recognized from church was standing nearby, and he smiled and said, "Happy New Year," and I echoed it back and took a long sip of wine. He introduced himself as Tom, said he worked at the hardware store, and we made small talk for a few minutes about the snow and whether the roads would be bad tomorrow, and I was grateful for the distraction, for the ability to pretend I was a normal person having a normal conversation at a normal party.
But I couldn't stop thinking about David's words, couldn't stop feeling the sting of them. You ruined my year.
I wanted to confront him, to ask him what he meant, to defend myself or demand an explanation, but I also knew that confronting him here in front of all these people would only make things worse. David hated scenes, hated anything that made him look bad in public, and if I approached him now, angry and hurt, he'd find a way to make me the problem, to paint me as emotional or irrational or embarrassing. So I stayed in the kitchen, drinking my wine and talking to Tom about nothing, and I waited. Around 12:30, people started to leave, a few couples with babysitters at home, some older folks who didn't want to drive too late in the snow, and the party began to thin out. I watched them go with envy, wishing I could leave too, but David had driven, and I had no way to get home unless I called a cab, which in Millbrook meant calling Jerry, who ran the one-car taxi service and who would definitely tell everyone he knew that Sarah Mitchell had left the Richardsons' party alone on New Year's Eve. So I stayed, nursing my wine, and eventually I drifted back into the living room where maybe a dozen people remained, the diehard who weren't ready for the night to end. David was sitting on the couch now, still talking to Mark, and there was an empty spot next to him that I supposed was meant for me, but I couldn't bring myself to sit there, to play the role of the dutiful wife after what he'd said. Instead, I sat in an armchair across the room, and I felt his eyes on me briefly before he looked away. Diane was telling a story about a vacation they'd taken to Florida, something funny about a rental car and a wrong turn, and people were laughing, and I tried to focus on her words, but they kept sliding away from me, meaningless sounds that couldn't penetrate the wall of hurt and anger I'd built around myself. At some point, Mark stood up and announced he needed to check something in his office, some work email that couldn't wait, and he asked David if he wanted to come with him, and David said sure. They disappeared down a hallway, and I sat there wondering what was so important it needed to be discussed at 1 in the morning on New Year's Day. Diane refilled drinks and put on different music, something jazzy and low, and the remaining guests settled into a comfortable lull, the kind of easy intimacy that comes late at night when everyone's had enough to drink and the pressure to be entertaining has faded. Jennifer sat down next to me and asked if I was having a good time, and I said yes, it was a lovely party, and she said Diane always threw the best parties, that this was a tradition they looked forward to every year. "You and David should come to our place sometime," Jennifer said. "We do a summer barbecue, nothing fancy, just neighbors and friends. I think you'd like it." I thanked her and said that sounded nice, and I meant it, even though I had no idea if David and I would still be together by summer, if we'd still be living in Millbrook, if any of this would matter. She started telling me about her daughter who was applying to colleges, how stressful the process was, how expensive everything had gotten, and I listened and nodded and made appropriate sympathetic noises, and it felt good to focus on someone else's problems for a while, to step outside my own misery. David and Mark returned after about 15 minutes, both looking pleased about something, and they sat back down on the couch. David caught my eye and gestured for me to come over, a small jerk of his head that was more command than invitation, and I felt a flash of defiance. I didn't move. I stayed where I was, talking to Jennifer, and I saw his jaw tighten, saw the irritation flash across his face, but he didn't say anything. Mark started talking about some changes coming to the bank, some restructuring at the regional level, and David's attention shifted back to him, and I was forgotten again. By 1:30, only 6 of us remained: Mark and Diane, David and me, and Jennifer and Phil. Diane brought out leftover appetizers, and we picked at them half-heartedly, and the conversation had turned slow and meandering, the way it does when everyone's tired but no one wants to be the first to leave. Phil was telling a story about ice fishing, something about a trip he'd taken with his father years ago, and Mark was asking questions, and David was listening with that polite interest he was so good at faking. I watched him and tried to remember when I'd fallen in love with him, what it was about him that had made me think we could build a life together, and I couldn't find it. The man sitting across from me was a stranger wearing my husband's face. At 2 o'clock, Jennifer yawned and said they should probably be going, and Phil agreed, and they stood up and started saying their goodbyes. Diane hugged them both and thanked them for coming, and Mark walked them to the door, and suddenly it was just the 4 of us, Mark and Diane, David and me, and the house felt very large and very quiet. Diane started collecting glasses and plates, and I stood up to help her, grateful for something to do with my hands. We carried things into the kitchen, and she thanked me and said I didn't have to help, but I insisted, and we worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, loading the dishwasher and covering leftover food with plastic wrap. "You and David seem like such a solid couple," Diane said suddenly, and I almost dropped the plate I was holding. I looked at her, and she was smiling, oblivious to the irony of her words, and I managed to smile back and say, "Thank you, that's kind of you to say." She leaned against the counter and sighed contentedly. 28 years Mark and I have been married, and I'll tell you, it takes work, but it's worth it. You just have to remember you're on the same team, you know? I nodded and said, yes, the same team, and I thought about how David and I weren't on the same team at all, how we were barely even playing the same game anymore. We finished cleaning up and went back to the living room where Mark and David were still talking, and I could tell from David's posture that he was ready to leave, that he'd stayed as long as he felt was necessary, and now he wanted to go home. He stood up when he saw me and said, "We should probably head out, let you folks get some sleep." Mark and Diane protested mildly, said we were welcome to stay longer, but David was already moving toward the hallway where our coats were, and I followed him, thanking Mark and Diane for their hospitality, telling them what a wonderful party it had been, performing the social niceties that small-town life required. The cold air hit me like a slap when we stepped outside, sharp and clean after the warmth of the house. The snow had stopped, but everything was covered in a fresh white layer, pristine and untouched, and our footsteps crunched loudly as we walked to the car. David didn't say anything, didn't open my door or wait for me, just got in and started the engine, and I climbed in beside him and buckled my seatbelt and stared straight ahead. He backed out of the driveway carefully, the tires slipping slightly on the snow, and then we were on the road heading back through the silent town toward our house on Maple Street, and the tension in the car was so thick I could barely breathe. We were halfway home when I finally spoke. "What did you mean?" My voice sounded strange in the quiet car, too loud and too small at the same time. David didn't look at me, kept his eyes on the road. "What did I mean about what?" he asked, and I could hear the edge in his voice, the warning. "At midnight, you said you ruined my year. What did you mean by that?" He paused for a long moment, and I watched his hands tighten on the steering wheel, watched the muscle in his jaw work. He didn't say anything. "I really want to do this now, Sarah." "Fine, you want to know what I meant? I meant exactly what I said. This whole year, you've been dragging me down. You're always moping around the house, always complaining that we don't spend enough time together, always making me feel guilty for actually having a career, for actually trying to build something. Do you know how exhausting that is? Do you know what it's like to come home every day to someone who's just there, waiting, needing something from me that I don't have to give?" His words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with precision, and I sat there stunned, unable to respond. If I've been working my ass off this year, trying to prove myself, trying to move up, and instead of supporting me, you've been this weight around my neck. And tonight, at the party, you couldn't even pretend to be happy. You stood there looking miserable, barely talking to anyone, making me look bad. So yes, Sarah, you ruined my year. You've been ruining it for months. We pulled into our driveway, and he put the car in park, but didn't turn off the engine. I sat there in the darkness, his words echoing in my head, and I realized that this was it. This was the moment where I had to decide who I was going to be. I could apologize, could try to smooth things over, could go back to making myself smaller and quieter and less of a burden, or I could do something different. I could choose myself. I turned to look at him, really look at him, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. "I want a divorce," I said quietly, and the words felt right, felt true, felt like the first honest thing I'd said in months. David's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with shock. "What?" he said, and I repeated it, stronger this time. "I want a divorce, David. I'm done." For a long moment, David just stared at me, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't quite read. Shock, disbelief, something that might have been anger or might have been fear. The engine was still running, the heat blowing through the vents, and I could see our breath fogging slightly in the cold air that seeped in through the imperfect seals of his car doors. "You're not serious," he said finally, and his voice had lost that cold control, had become something uncertain, almost pleading. "You don't mean that. You're upset. You've been drinking. We can talk about this tomorrow when we've both calmed down." I shook my head slowly, deliberately. "I'm completely serious, and I'm not that drunk. I've never been more clear-headed in my life, actually." I reached for the door handle, ready to get out, ready to walk into our house and start figuring out what came next. But David grabbed my arm, not hard, but firm enough to stop me. "Sarah, wait, just wait a second." His voice had changed again, softer now, the tone he used to use when we first started dating, when he still cared about what I thought and felt. "I'm sorry, okay? I shouldn't have said those things. I was frustrated. I've been under a lot of pressure at work, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a vast emptiness where my feelings for him used to be. "Let go of me," I said quietly, and after a moment, he did, his hand dropping back to his lap. "This isn't about what you said tonight, David. Or it's not just about that. It's about everything. It's about the last year, the last 2 years maybe. It's about how you treat me like I'm invisible unless you need something. It's about how you've built this whole life that doesn't include me, and then you blame me for not being happy about it." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen 1,000 times. "That's not true. That's not fair. I've been working hard for us, for our future. Everything I've done has been to build a better life." I almost laughed at that. "For us? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted? When was the last time we made a decision together? You got promoted and you didn't even celebrate with me. You go to parties and events and you don't invite me. You come home and you act like I'm a burden you have to tolerate. That's not a marriage, David. That's not even a partnership. That's just you living your life and me existing in the background of it." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was tight. "So what? You're just going to give up? Just throw away 6 years because things got hard for a while?" "I'm not giving up," I said, and I felt the truth of it settle into my bones. "I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing to not spend another year feeling like I'm not enough, like I'm the problem, like I'm ruining your life just by existing in it." I opened the door, and the cold air rushed in, sharp and clarifying. "I'm going inside. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out the details, but I'm done, David. I'm really done." I got out of the car and walked toward the house, my heels crunching on the snow-covered walkway, and I heard him get out behind me, heard his door slam. "Sarah, come on, don't do this. Let's just go inside and talk like adults." I unlocked the front door and stepped into the dark hallway, reaching for the light switch. "I am talking like an adult. I'm telling you what I need, and what I need is to not be married to you anymore." He followed me inside and closed the door, and we stood there in the hallway, facing each other like strangers. The house was cold, we'd turned down the heat before leaving, and I could see our Christmas tree lights blinking in the living room, cheerful and absurd given the circumstances. "You're making a mistake," David said, and there was an edge to his voice now, the anger starting to surface. "You think you're going to be better off without me? You think it's easy out there? You work from home doing freelance design work that barely pays anything. You don't have friends here. You don't have family nearby. What are you going to do, Sarah? Where are you going to go?" His words were meant to scare me, to make me doubt myself, and a few months ago they might have worked. But standing there in our cold hallway at 2:30 in the morning on New Year's Day, I realized I wasn't scared. I was tired, and I was hurt, and I was done, but I wasn't scared. "I'll figure it out," I said simply. "I've been figuring things out by myself for a long time now anyway." I walked past him, toward the stairs, and he grabbed my arm again, harder this time. "Don't walk away from me when I'm talking to you." I looked down at his hand, then up at his face, and I saw something there that made my stomach tighten, a flash of real anger barely controlled. "Let go of me, David." For a moment, he didn't move, and I could feel the tension radiating off him, could see him struggling with something internal. Then he released me abruptly and stepped back, holding up his hands. "Fine, go. Run away like you always do when things get difficult." I didn't bother responding to that, just turned and walked up the stairs, my legs shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion and the weight of what I'd just done. The guest room was small and cold, the bed neatly made because no one ever used it. I closed the door behind me and sat down on the edge of the mattress, and for the first time all night, I let myself feel the full weight of everything that had happened. I'd asked for a divorce. I'd actually said the words out loud, had made them real, and there was no taking them back now. I heard David moving around downstairs, heard cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen, heard the television turn on and then off again. I wondered what he was thinking, if he was angry or hurt or relieved, if some part of him had been wanting this too, but hadn't had the courage to say it. I hung up my dress in the closet, put on the spare pajamas I kept in the guest room dresser for the nights when David's snoring kept me awake, and I climbed into the cold bed and pulled the blankets up to my chin. I didn't sleep. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me, listening to David finally come upstairs around 3 and go into our bedroom, his bedroom now, I suppose, and close the door. I thought about all the things that would have to happen next, the conversations and the lawyers and the division of our lives into yours and mine. I thought about telling my parents, who lived in Ohio, and who loved David, who would ask me if I was sure, if I'd tried hard enough, if I was throwing away a good thing. I thought about staying in Millbrook or leaving, about starting over somewhere new, where no one knew me as David's wife, where I could just be Sarah, whoever that was. The thoughts circled, and somewhere around 4:30 a.m. I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke up to gray morning light filtering through the curtains and the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. I reached for it groggily and saw that it was almost 10 o'clock, later than I'd slept in months. I had 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize and a voicemail. I sat up, my head aching slightly from the wine and the lack of sleep, and I listened to the voicemail. It was a woman's voice, professional and friendly. "Hi, Sarah. This is Monica Chen from Hartwell Design Group in Boston. I hope you had a wonderful New Year's Eve. I'm calling because we received your portfolio submission last month and we're very impressed with your work. We have a senior designer position opening up and we'd love to talk to you about it if you're interested. The position would start in February and would require relocation to Boston, but we offer competitive salary and full benefits. Please give me a call back at your earliest convenience. Looking forward to speaking with you." I sat there staring at my phone, trying to process what I'd just heard. Hartwell Design Group was one of the top firms in New England, the kind of place I dreamed about working when I first graduated, but had never thought would be interested in someone like me. I'd submitted my portfolio back in November on a whim, during those late nights when David was out and I was feeling particularly invisible, when I'd been scrolling through job listings and thinking about what my life might look like if I had the courage to change it. I'd never expected to hear back, honestly forgotten I'd even applied. And now they're offering me an interview, maybe even a job, and the timing was so perfect it felt almost surreal. I got out of bed and opened the door carefully, listening for sounds of David downstairs. The house was quiet, and when I went down to the kitchen, I found a note on the counter in his handwriting. "Went to the gym, then going to help Mark with something. We need to talk when I get back. Don't do anything stupid." I read it twice, feeling a mixture of irritation and relief. Don't do anything stupid. Like asking for a divorce was stupid? Like wanting more from my life than being ignored and blamed was stupid? I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, then made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my phone. I called Monica Chen back and got her voicemail, left a message saying I was very interested and would love to schedule a time to talk. Then I opened my laptop and started researching apartments in Boston, looking at prices and neighborhoods, trying to imagine myself there, starting over, being someone new. Around noon, my phone rang again. It was Monica, calling back already, and we talked for 20 minutes about the position, about my experience, about what they were looking for. She asked if I could come to Boston for an in-person interview next week, and I said yes without hesitation, without thinking about David or the house or anything except the possibility of escape. We scheduled it for Thursday, and when I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, tangible hope that my life could be different, that I could be different.
I spent the rest of the afternoon working on my portfolio, updating it with recent projects, preparing for the interview, and I was so absorbed in it that I didn't hear David come home until he was standing in the doorway of my office. "What are you doing?" he asked, and I looked up to see him in his gym clothes, sweaty and disheveled, holding a bag from the diner. "Working," I said simply, and turned back to my computer. He came into the room and set the bag on my desk. "I brought you lunch, Turkey Club, your favorite." I looked at the bag but didn't open it. "Thank you," I said, my voice neutral. He sat down on the small couch against the wall, the one I sometimes napped on when I was working late, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the divorce." I saved my work and turned to face him, waiting. "I don't want that," he continued. "I don't want to lose you. I know I've been a shitty husband lately. I know I've taken you for granted, but I can change. We can fix this." I looked at him sitting there, trying to appear sincere, and I wondered if he actually meant it or if he was just scared of how a divorce would look, how it would affect his reputation in town, his standing at the bank. "David, you told me I ruined your year. You said I was a weight around your neck. You don't say things like that to someone you want to stay married to." He ran his hand over his face, a gesture of frustration. "I was angry. I was drunk. I didn't mean it the way it sounded." I shook my head. "Yes, you did. You meant every word. And honestly, that's okay. Maybe I have been holding you back. Maybe we're just not good for each other anymore. But either way, I'm done trying to be someone I'm not just to make you happy." He stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. "So that's it. You've just decided and I don't get a say? We don't even try counseling or anything?" I thought about that, about sitting in some therapist's office trying to explain how lonely I'd been, how small I'd felt, while David performed the role of the concerned husband. "I don't think counseling can fix this," I said quietly. "I think we're past that." He stopped pacing and looked at me, and I saw something crumble in his expression, something that might have been genuine hurt. "I love you, Sarah. I know I haven't shown it well, but I do." And maybe he did in his own limited way, but it wasn't enough. Love without respect, without partnership, without basic kindness wasn't the kind of love I wanted anymore. I have a job interview in Boston next week, and I watched his face change, watched the hurt transform into anger. "You what?" His voice was sharp, disbelieving. "You're already looking for jobs? You're already planning to leave?" I met his eyes steadily. "Yes, I applied for a position back in November, and they called me this morning. It's a good opportunity, David. It's the kind of work I've always wanted to do." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So you've been planning this. You've been planning to leave me for months." I shook my head. "No, I applied for a job because I was unhappy and I wanted to see what else was out there. I didn't plan any of this, but now that it's happening, I'm not going to pretend I'm not relieved." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing, could see the realization settling in that I was serious, that this was really happening. "Fine," he said finally, his voice cold again. "If that's what you want, fine, but don't expect me to make this easy for you. This house, our savings, everything we've built, you're not just going to walk away with half of it." I felt a chill run through me at the threat in his voice, but I kept my expression calm. "We can work that out with lawyers. I'm not trying to take anything from you, David. I just want out." He turned and walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back at me. "You're going to regret this, Sarah. You're going to realize what you gave up, and it's going to be too late." Then he left, and I heard him go upstairs, heard the bedroom door slam, and I sat there in my office surrounded by my work, my plans, my future, and I didn't feel regret at all. I felt free. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended tension, like living in a house with a stranger who happened to know all your routines and habits. David and I moved around each other carefully, speaking only when necessary, conducting the mundane business of daily life with cold politeness. He slept in our bedroom, I stayed in the guest room, and we took turns using the kitchen and bathroom like roommates who couldn't stand each other.
He went to work each day, came home late, and spent his evenings either in the bedroom or down in the basement where he'd set up a small gym. I worked on my portfolio, prepared for my interview, and started quietly packing some of my things into boxes I'd brought up from the basement when he wasn't home. Mrs. Henderson must have sensed something was wrong because she stopped appearing at her kitchen window when I was outside, giving us privacy we hadn't asked for but desperately needed. On Tuesday morning, I called a lawyer in Albany that I'd found through an online search, a woman named Patricia Brennan who specialized in divorce cases. Her voice on the phone was kind but professional, and she asked me basic questions about our marriage, our assets, whether there were children involved. I answered everything as clearly as I could, and she said she could meet with me on Wednesday afternoon if I could make the drive. I said yes, I'd be there, and after I hung up, I felt the reality of it settle over me again. I was really doing this, really ending my marriage, really blowing up the life I'd built in Millbrook. Part of me wanted to feel sad about it, wanted to mourn what we'd had in the beginning, but mostly I just felt tired and ready for it to be over. David found out about the lawyer appointment because he went through my phone while I was in the shower on Tuesday night. I came out to find him sitting on the guest room bed holding my phone, his face dark with anger. "Patricia Brennan," he said, his voice tight. "You've already hired a divorce lawyer?" I grabbed the phone from his hand, furious at the invasion of privacy, but trying to keep my voice level. "I have a consultation with a lawyer, yes. That's what people do when they're getting divorced, David, and you have no right to go through my phone." He stood up, and I could see he was barely controlling his temper. "I have every right. You're my wife, and you're sneaking around behind my back planning all this without even trying to work things out." I stepped back, putting distance between us, suddenly aware of how much bigger he was than me, how angry he looked. "I'm not sneaking around. I told you I wanted a divorce. I'm taking the steps to make that happen, and I'm not your wife in any way that matters anymore." He moved toward the door, then turned back, and his voice when he spoke was low and mean. "You know what everyone's going to say, right? Poor David, his wife just left him out of nowhere. Ungrateful Sarah couldn't appreciate what she had. You think you're going to come out of this looking good? You think people are going to take your side?" I felt something cold settle in my stomach, because I knew he was right, at least partially. In a town like Millbrook, the narrative would be shaped by who told it first, who told it best, and David was much better at managing his image than I was. "I don't care what people say," I said, and I tried to mean it. "I care about getting out of this marriage and starting over." He laughed, that same humorless sound from before. "You're going to care when you can't find work because everyone knows you as the woman who abandoned her husband. You're going to care when you're alone in some shitty apartment in Boston wondering why you threw away a perfectly good life." His words were designed to hurt, to make me doubt myself, and I felt them land even as I tried to deflect them. "Get out of my room." He stared at me for another long moment, then left, slamming the door behind him hard enough that I heard something rattle on the dresser. I sat down on the bed, my hands shaking, and I realized that this was going to get ugly, that David wasn't going to let me go quietly, that I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Wednesday morning, I drove to Albany for my appointment with Patricia Brennan. The drive took about 45 minutes, winding through small towns and frozen farmland, the sky a flat gray that promised more snow. Her office was in a renovated Victorian house near the downtown area, and when I walked in, I was greeted by a receptionist who offered me coffee and told me Patricia would be with me in just a moment. I sat in the waiting room, looking at the framed degrees on the wall, the family photos on the desk, trying to calm my nerves. When Patricia came out to get me, she was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and a firm handshake. Her office was warm and comfortable, filled with books and plants, and she gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs across from her desk.
We talked for over an hour. She asked detailed questions about our marriage, our finances, our property, and I answered as honestly as I could. We didn't own the house we lived in, which simplified things, but we had a joint savings account, joint credit cards, a car, and both our names. She explained the process, the timeline, what I could expect in terms of division of assets. She asked if there had been any abuse, and I hesitated before saying no, not physical abuse, but that David had become increasingly controlling and verbally cruel. She made notes and said that emotional abuse was still abuse, that it could be relevant to the proceedings. When I told her about the job opportunity in Boston, she said that was good, that having independent income and a plan for where I'd live would strengthen my position. By the time I left her office, I had a folder full of paperwork to fill out and a clearer sense of what the next few months would look like. I drove back to Millbrook feeling both relieved and anxious, and when I got home, David's car was in the driveway, even though it was only 2 in the afternoon. I found him in the kitchen, and Mark Richardson was there too, sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee. They both looked up when I walked in, and I felt immediately defensive, like I'd walked into an ambush. "Sarah," Mark said, standing up and offering me that professional smile he was so good at. "Good to see you. I hope you don't mind me stopping by." I set my purse down on the counter, trying to read the situation. "Of course not. Is everything okay?" David was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, and he didn't look at me. Mark cleared his throat. "David mentioned that you two are going through a rough patch, and I just wanted to check in, see if there's anything Diane and I can do to help. We've been through our own struggles over the years, and sometimes it helps to talk to people who've been there." I looked at David, understanding immediately what he was doing. He was getting ahead of the narrative, positioning himself as the concerned husband trying to save his marriage, while I was the one giving up. "That's very kind of you, Mark," I said carefully, "but I think this is something David and I need to work out privately." Mark nodded, but he didn't move to leave. Of course. I just want you to know that David is like family to us, and by extension, so are you. If you need anything, counseling recommendations, someone to talk to, anything at all, we're here." The subtext was clear. David had already told his version of events, had already painted himself as the victim, and Mark was here to show support for him, not for us as a couple. "I appreciate that," I said, keeping my voice neutral, and I looked at David. "Can I talk to you alone for a minute?" Mark took the hint and stood up, clapping David on the shoulder. "I'll let you two talk. Just remember what I said, David. These things take time, but they're worth fighting for." He nodded at me and let himself out, and I waited until I heard his car start before I turned to David. "What the hell was that?" David shrugged, his expression defiant. "Mark's my friend. I told him we were having problems. He wanted to help." I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. "You told him your version of our problems. You're already setting up the story, making sure everyone knows that you're the good guy and I'm the one breaking our marriage for no reason." He pushed off the counter, his jaw tight. "What did you expect me to do, Sarah? Just let you destroy everything without saying anything? People are going to ask questions. They're going to want to know what happened. I'm just being honest." "Honest," I repeated, and I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. "You're being strategic. You're managing your image. That's what you've always been good at." He stepped closer, and I could see the anger in his eyes. "And what are you going to tell people? That I was a terrible husband? That I neglected you? That I said some things I shouldn't have when I was drunk and stressed? You think that's going to make you look good?" I held my ground, refusing to back down. "I'm not going to tell people anything. I'm going to leave, and they can think whatever they want." He laughed, sharp and mean. "You're so naive. You think you can just disappear and start over and no one will care? This is a small town, Sarah. People talk, and when they do, I'm going to make sure they know the truth, that I tried everything to save our marriage and you gave up." I felt something break inside me then, the last fragile hope that we could do this civilly, that we could end our marriage with some dignity intact. "Fine," I said quietly. "Tell them whatever you want. I don't care anymore." I walked past him toward the stairs, and he called after me. "You're going to regret this. When you're alone and struggling and you realize what you gave up, you're going to regret it." I didn't turn around, didn't respond, just kept walking up to the guest room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and pulled out my phone, looking at the details for my interview in Boston tomorrow. I'd planned to drive up in the morning, do the interview, and drive back, but suddenly I didn't want to come back. I didn't want to spend another night in this house, walking on eggshells around David's anger, feeling the walls close in on me. I opened my laptop and searched for hotels in Boston, found one near the design firm that had good reviews and wasn't too expensive. I booked it for tomorrow night and Friday night, giving myself a buffer, a chance to look at apartments and get a feel for the city. Then I pulled out my suitcase and started packing properly, not just a few things for an interview, but enough clothes for a week, my toiletries, my laptop and work files, the few pieces of jewelry that mattered to me. I was methodical about it, making sure I didn't forget anything important, and when I was done, I sat on the bed and looked around the guest room that had become my refuge. I wouldn't miss this house. I wouldn't miss this town. I wouldn't miss the person I'd become here, small and quiet and invisible. That night, I barely slept again. I lay in the dark, listening to David move around the house, heard him on the phone with someone, probably Mark or one of his other friends, his voice low and angry. Around midnight, he came upstairs, and I heard him pause outside the guest room door, and for a moment I thought he might try to come in, but then his footsteps continued down the hall to the bedroom. I stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that had led to this moment, all the small compromises and quiet disappointments, all the times I'd swallowed my feelings to keep the peace, all the ways I'd made myself smaller to make room for David's ego. I thought about the woman I'd been when we first met, confident and ambitious and full of plans, and I wondered when exactly I'd lost her. But I also knew that she wasn't gone, just buried, and maybe moving to Boston and starting over was how I'd find her again. Thursday morning, I woke up early and got ready quietly, putting on the outfit I'd chosen for the interview, black pants, a silk blouse, a blazer that made me look professional and competent. I did my makeup carefully, pulled my hair back in a neat ponytail, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who looked like she had her life together, even if that was still more aspiration than reality. I carried my suitcase downstairs as quietly as I could, but David was already in the kitchen, drinking coffee and staring at his phone. He looked up when I came in, his eyes going to the suitcase. "You're leaving," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I have my interview today. I'm staying in Boston for a couple of days to look at apartments." His face hardened. "So that's it. You're just going." "I'm coming back to get the rest of my things," I said. "But yes, I'm going." He set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "You know what? Fine. Go. Run away. But don't expect me to be here waiting when you realize you made a mistake." I looked at him standing there in our kitchen, this man I'd promised to love forever, and I felt nothing but relief that I was leaving. "I won't," I said simply. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the door, and he didn't try to stop me. I loaded everything into my car, scraped the frost off the windshield, and pulled out of the driveway without looking back. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and as I drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook toward the highway, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like myself again. The drive to Boston took about 3 hours, and I spent most of it listening to music and trying not to think too hard about what I was doing, about the life I was leaving behind, and the uncertain future I was driving toward. The interview was at 11, and I arrived with plenty of time to spare, found parking in a garage nearby, and walked to the Hartwell Design Group offices in the financial district. The building was modern and sleek, all glass and steel, and when I stepped into the lobby, I felt a thrill of possibility. This was the kind of place I dreamed about working, the kind of environment where I could do real creative work, where I could be challenged and valued and seen. The interview lasted almost 2 hours, and it went better than I could have hoped for. Monica Chen was warm and enthusiastic, and she introduced me to several other members of the team, showed me around the office, explained their current projects and their vision for the future. They asked about my experience, my design philosophy, my long-term goals, and I answered honestly and confidently, feeling more like myself than I had in months.
At the end, Monica walked me back to the lobby and said they'd be making a decision within the next week, but that I should feel very good about how it went. I thanked her and shook her hand, and when I walked out of that building into the cold Boston afternoon, I felt like I was walking into a new life. I spent the rest of the day exploring the city, looking at neighborhoods where I might want to live, checking out coffee shops and bookstores and parks. I met with a realtor who showed me 3 apartments, and the second one felt right. A 1-bedroom in Somerville, hardwood floors and big windows, and a kitchen that was small but functional. It was more expensive than what I was paying in Millbrook, but if I got this job, I could afford it. I stayed in Boston through the weekend, and by the time I drove back to Millbrook on Sunday afternoon, I had signed a lease on the apartment in Somerville, contingent on getting the job, and I had a moving date circled on my calendar for the first week of February. The city had felt right in a way that Millbrook never had, full of possibility and anonymity, a place where I could be just another person trying to build a life, rather than David Mitchell's wife who couldn't make her marriage work. The drive back felt longer than the drive there had been, and as I got closer to town, I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety about what I'd be walking into. I'd turned my phone back on Saturday morning to find 17 missed calls from David and a series of texts that ranged from angry to pleading to threatening. I'd responded to only one, telling him I'd be back Sunday and we could talk then, and I'd ignored everything else. When I pulled into our driveway, David's car was there, and so was another car I didn't recognize, a silver sedan parked on the street. I grabbed my purse and walked up to the house, and before I could get my keys out, the front door opened and David was standing there, his face tight and unreadable. "You're back," he said, and I nodded and stepped past him into the hallway. The house smelled stale, like he hadn't opened any windows all weekend, and I could see dishes piled in the kitchen sink, mail scattered on the counter. "We have a guest," David said, and I turned to see a man emerging from the living room, middle-aged and professional-looking, in khakis and a button-down shirt. "Sarah, this is Jim Kowalski. He's a mediator. I thought it might help if we had someone neutral to help us work through some of these issues." I looked from the mediator to David, understanding immediately that this was another strategic move, another way for David to control the narrative and the process. "I already have a lawyer, David. I don't need a mediator." Jim Kowalski stepped forward with a practiced smile. "I understand this is unexpected, Sarah, but mediation can actually save you both a lot of time and money compared to going through the courts. I'm just here to facilitate a conversation, help you both figure out what's fair." I set my purse down and crossed my arms. "What's fair is that we split our assets 50-50 and we both move on with our lives. I don't think we need a mediator for that." David's jaw tightened. "It's not that simple, and you know it. We need to talk about the car, the savings account, the furniture, all of it. And we need to do it like adults, not through lawyers who are just going to drag this out and cost us a fortune." I looked at Jim Kowalski, who was watching me with that carefully neutral expression mediators must practice in the mirror, and I realized that if I refused to participate, I'd look unreasonable, uncooperative, exactly the way David wanted me to look. "Fine," I said. "We can talk, but I'm not agreeing to anything today. I need to review everything with my lawyer first." Jim nodded approvingly. "That's completely reasonable. Today is just about opening a dialogue, seeing where you both stand." We sat down in the living room, me on one end of the couch, David on the other, Jim in the armchair between us with a legal pad and a pen. For the next 2 hours, we went through the tedious inventory of our shared life, the savings account that had about $12,000 in it, the car that was in both our names but that David drove, the furniture we'd bought together, the wedding gifts that were technically ours but that I had no interest in fighting over. Jim asked questions, took notes, and occasionally offered suggestions about what was standard in divorce settlements, and through it all, David maintained this facade of reasonableness, of being the rational one willing to compromise, while I was the one being difficult. When we got to the topic of the security deposit on the house, David thought he should get it back, since he'd be the one staying and dealing with the landlord, and I pointed out that we'd both paid it, that it was joint money, and that I was entitled to half. Jim made a note and said that was something we could work out. By the time we finished, I was exhausted and frustrated, and ready for Jim Kowalski to leave so I could go upstairs and be alone. David walked him to the door, and I heard them talking in low voices in the hallway. Heard David thank him for coming. Heard Jim say something about how these things take time, but that he thought we could reach an agreement. When David came back into the living room, I was gathering my things, ready to retreat to the guest room. "It wasn't so bad, was it?" he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the sense that he'd won something. "It was fine," I said, flatly. But I meant what I said. I'm not agreeing to anything without talking to my lawyer first. He sat down in the couch, in the spot I'd just vacated, and looked up at me. "Sarah, I've been thinking, maybe we're moving too fast with all this. Maybe we should take some time, try a separation instead of jumping straight to divorce. Give ourselves some space to figure out what we really want." I stared at him, trying to understand what angle he was working, what he thought he'd gain by dragging this out. "I know what I want, David. I want a divorce. I want to move to Boston and start over. That hasn't changed." His expression shifted, became harder. "You got the job." It wasn't a question. "They called Friday. They offered me the position, and I accepted. I hadn't planned to tell him yet, but there was no point in hiding it now." He nodded slowly, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. "So you've got it all figured out. New job, new city, new life. What about me, Sarah? What about what I want?" I felt a flash of anger so intense it surprised me. "What about what you want? You've spent the last year doing exactly what you want, living exactly the life you want, and treating me like an inconvenience. You don't get to suddenly care about my plans now that I'm leaving." He stood up abruptly, and I took a step back instinctively. "I'm trying here. I'm trying to make this work, to find a solution that doesn't blow up both our lives, and you're just being stubborn and selfish." "I'm being selfish?" My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. "I've spent 6 years putting your career first, your needs first, your happiness first, and the one time I choose myself, I'm selfish?" He moved closer, and I could see the anger radiating off him. "You know what your problem is, Sarah. You're never satisfied. I gave you a good life, a nice house, stability, and it was never enough. You always wanted more, needed more attention, more validation, more everything. And now you're throwing it all away because you think some job in Boston is going to make you happy. But it won't. You'll still be you, and you'll still be miserable." His words were designed to cut, to make me doubt myself, and I felt them land as I tried to deflect them. But I also felt something else, a clarity, a certainty that I was doing the right thing, that staying with him would be the real mistake. "I'd rather be miserable and alone than miserable with you," I said quietly, and I watched his face change, watched the anger give way to something that looked almost like hurt. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get your stuff and get out. I don't want you here anymore." I nodded, feeling strangely calm. "I'll pack tonight and leave in the morning." I turned and walked upstairs, and I heard him slam his fist against the wall behind me, heard him curse, but I didn't look back. I spent the next 3 hours packing everything I owned into boxes and suitcases, working methodically through the guest room and then the bedroom, taking my clothes and my books and the few personal items that mattered to me. David stayed downstairs, and I could hear the television on too loud, could hear him moving around, but he didn't come up to check on me or try to stop me. Around 10 o'clock, I carried the first load of boxes down to my car, and Mrs. Henderson's light was on next door. I wondered if she was watching, if she'd figured out what was happening, if she'd have opinions about it. I made 3 more trips, loading everything into my car and the small cargo carrier I'd rented that afternoon, and by 11:30, I was done. Everything I owned fit into one car, which was either depressing or liberating depending on how I looked at it. I went back inside one last time to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything, and I found David sitting in the dark living room, a beer in his hand, staring at nothing. "I'm leaving now," I said from the doorway. He didn't look at me. "I'll have my lawyer send over the paperwork about the asset division. We can handle the rest through them." "You're making a mistake," he said, and his voice was flat, emotionless. "You're going to regret this." I'd heard that so many times now that it had lost its power. "Maybe," I said, "but it's my mistake to make." I walked out of the house, got in my car, and drove away from Maple Street for the last time. It was late and the roads were empty, and I drove through the dark town toward the highway, past the church and the diner and the hardware store, past all the landmarks of the life I was leaving behind. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad. I felt tired and relieved and cautiously hopeful. And as I merged onto the highway heading east toward Boston, I turned on the radio and let the music fill the car. And I let myself imagine what came next. I arrived at my hotel in Boston around 3 in the morning, exhausted but too wired to sleep. I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, looking at the photos Monica had sent me of the design team, reading through the offer letter one more time, making lists of everything I needed to do before I started the job in 3 weeks. Around 4, I finally fell asleep, and when I woke up Monday morning, the sun was streaming through the hotel window, and my phone was buzzing with a call from Patricia Brennan, my lawyer. I answered groggily, and she said she'd received an email from David's lawyer, apparently he'd hired one over the weekend, proposing a settlement. She read through the terms, and they were mostly reasonable, close to the 50-50 split I'd expected, though David was asking for a larger share of the savings account to cover what he claimed were debts he'd paid off during our marriage. Patricia said we could counteroffer, that she didn't think his requests were outrageous, but that we could negotiate. I told her to do whatever she thought was fair, that I just wanted it done as quickly as possible. She said she'd handle it, and that I should focus on getting settled in Boston, on starting my new job, on moving forward. We hung up, and I lay there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks. The party, the midnight moment, the decision to leave, the interview, the job offer, the final confrontation with David. It felt surreal, like it had happened to someone else. But it had happened to me, and I had survived it, and now I was here, in a hotel room in a city that was about to become my home, and I was okay. I spent the next 2 weeks in a blur of activity, moving into my apartment, buying furniture, setting up utilities, learning the subway system, exploring my new neighborhood. I started my job at Hartwell Design Group on a Monday in early February, and from the first day, I knew I'd made the right choice. The work was challenging and creative, my colleagues were talented and welcoming, and Monica Chen was the kind of boss who pushed you to be better while also supporting you when you struggled. I worked long hours, stayed late, volunteered for extra projects, and I threw myself into building this new life with an intensity that surprised me. Some nights I came home to my empty apartment and felt the loneliness creep in, felt the weight of being alone in a new city where I didn't know anyone, but mostly I felt grateful that I'd had the courage to leave, grateful that I'd chosen myself. The divorce was finalized in April, 4 months after that New Year's Eve party where everything had changed. Patricia called to tell me the judge had signed the papers, that it was official, that I was no longer married to David Mitchell. I thanked her and hung up, and I sat in my apartment looking out the window at the Boston skyline, and I waited to feel something. Sadness, regret, relief, but mostly I just felt tired. That evening, I went out with some colleagues from work, and we had dinner at a restaurant in the North End, and someone ordered champagne to celebrate a project we'd just finished. And when they poured me a glass, I thought about that New Year's Eve, about standing in the Richardsons' living room holding champagne and feeling invisible, and I realized how far I'd come. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was building a life that was mine, on my terms, and it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. I heard through mutual acquaintances that David was still in Millbrook, still working at the bank, still telling anyone who would listen that I'd left him without warning, that I'd given up on our marriage, that he'd tried everything to save it. I heard that he was dating someone new, the woman in the red dress from the party, and I felt nothing about that except a vague hope that maybe she'd be what he needed, that maybe they'd be happy together in a way we never were. I heard that Mrs. Henderson had moved into a nursing home, that the house on Maple Street had new renters, that life in that small town had continued on without me just fine. And I was glad that I wasn't there anymore, glad that I'd found the strength to leave, glad that midnight on New Year's Eve was the beginning of something new instead of just another ending. 6 months after I moved to Boston, I was promoted to lead designer on a major project, and Monica took me out to drinks to celebrate. We sat in a bar in Cambridge, and she asked me how I was doing, really doing, and I told her the truth, that I was happy, that I was proud of the work I was doing, that I was still figuring out who I was outside of being someone's wife, but that I liked the person I was becoming. She smiled and raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said. And I clinked my glass against hers and said, "To choosing yourself." And we drank to that, to the courage it takes to walk away from what's comfortable and familiar, to the strength it takes to believe you deserve better, to the hope that comes with starting over. That night, walking home through the streets of Somerville, I thought about David's words that night in the car, about how he said I ruined his year. And I realized that maybe I had, in a way. Maybe my unhappiness, my quiet resistance to making myself smaller, my eventual decision to leave, maybe all of that had ruined his carefully constructed image of the perfect life, the perfect marriage, the perfect wife who stayed in the background and didn't ask for too much. But in ruining his year, I'd saved my own life, and I couldn't regret that. I wouldn't regret that. Because the truth was that midnight hadn't changed everything in the way I'd hoped when I was standing in that living room waiting for the countdown. Midnight had just been a moment, a catalyst, a breaking point. The real change had come in the days and weeks and months after, in every small decision I'd made to choose myself, to believe I deserved more, to walk away from what was killing me slowly and towards something that felt like living. And now, standing in my own apartment, in my own city, with my own career and my own future stretching out ahead of me, I understood something I hadn't understood that New Year's Eve. That you don't need midnight to change your life. You don't need a dramatic moment, or a public confrontation, or a perfect catalyst. You just need the courage to take the first step, and then the next one, and then the next one, until one day you look around and realize you've built something new, something that's entirely yours, something that no one can take away from you. And that's what I'd done. I'd taken my life back, one day at a time, and I'd survived. And more than that, I'd started to thrive. The woman who'd stood in the Richardsons' living room feeling invisible was gone, and in her place was someone stronger, someone braver, someone who knew her own worth. And that was worth more than any marriage, any approval, any version of happiness that required me to be less than I was.
If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life or found the courage to choose yourself, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of strength, resilience, and new beginnings. Drop a comment below telling us about a time you chose yourself. We'd love to hear your story. And remember, you deserve a life where you're seen, valued, and celebrated for exactly who you are. Thank you for watching, and here's to your own new beginning.